Good morning, Willowbrook. It's good to be back. I've been missing for about 3 to 4 weeks, and I'm in full recovery mode now. And I hope that you've already read chapter 41 in Genesis, because I'm going to try to give you a little bit of understanding on the chapter. Yesterday, Steve's devotional was talking about Joseph serving out a sentence for a crime that he didn't commit, and he's in the king's dungeon. Verse 1 tells us that Joseph had been in that dungeon for a while, for 2 years. You see, 2 years earlier, Joseph had interpreted a dream for the royal cupbearer who was in the dungeon with him, and he said these words, "Remember me." Just 3 days after Joseph made that request, the cupbearer is released and restored to his former position with Pharaoh. But sadly, he forgot about Joseph, who had been his friend in prison. Every day for Joseph was the same. Get up, hopefully have a crumb to eat, work under the worst conditions imaginable, hopefully get a crumb to eat, and then go to sleep. Repeat, 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 until he was going to die in the dungeon. This looked like the ending of a long series of anger, dislike, and injustice. Joseph had already felt the hatred of his brothers, and it's tough to feel the hatred of a brother. He had been torn away from his home for forever. He knew what it was like to be a slave, and he knew what it was like to feel the sting of lies and slander, and knowing that people would believe the lies when the truth stood in front of them. You know, there are people who would rather climb a tree to tell a lie when they could just easily stand on the ground and tell the truth. But they climb that tree time after time and day after day because people believe them. They believe them even when there is no proof. Now, Joseph must have felt that nothing was ever going to change. He probably thought that his entire life had been destroyed by a lie. But it's right there in the heat of suffering that our faith is attacked with doubts and anger and confusion, loneliness and sorrow. You see, suffering always changes us, but for some, not necessarily for the better. But Joseph held on to one simple truth that kept him going. If you read through the lines of chapter 41, you look at everything that Joseph does, his character. If you read between the lines, these are the words that you would see. God has a plan for my life, plans to prosper me and not to harm me. And that is true of every one of us. Now, prosper does not mean wealth. Prosper just means being in the center of God's will. You know, pain and suffering is like a refiner's fire in the molding of the child of God. We find that truth throughout the pages of Scripture. And when it looks like nothing's happening in your life, when it looks like nothing's ever going to change, the truth is that your life and the circumstances of your life are being aligned with the process of waiting on the Lord, who is actually molding you through suffering. Sometimes trusting God does not make sense, but we must trust anyway and know that God has a plan for us. In our chapter, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile and he sees seven basically fat and happy cows. And then he saw 7 more cows, ugly and malnourished, and this time the malnourished cows ate up the fat and happy cows. Then Pharaoh had a second dream. It was really the same, but this second dream was about 7 ears of grain. Now, verse 8 tells us that Pharaoh was upset, and he sent for all the wise men of his court, and he told them his dream, but not a one of them could interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Then a light bulb went off in the head of the royal cupbearer, and he remembered a Hebrew slave who was in prison with him that had correctly interpreted his dream and the dream of the former royal baker. And Joseph immediately called before Pharaoh. Now think about that. He had spent all that time in a stinking dungeon, filthy and pitiful, and now he realizes, I've got to bathe. I've got to shave my face. I get to put on clean clothes for the first time in many, many years. And Pharaoh's going to explain to him these baffling dreams because he heard Joseph could interpret them. Standing before Pharaoh, Joseph was a man who always trusted in God's plan, even in suffering. There's a saying that Satan rushes and pushes us, but God leads us. As I study the Bible, I don't see anywhere where Jesus was in a hurry or Jesus got rushed, and we must be the same. It would have been easy for Joseph to take credit for interpreting dreams. It would have been easy for him to try to steal credit and look important to Pharaoh. But Joseph, he did what we should do. He said, it's not me, it's God. Joseph was very clear about what he finds, where he finds his success. He didn't let the material things of Pharaoh's palace or the splendor of the palace or the gold or anything that he might desire. You see, that didn't let him forget that without God, I am nothing. He's the source of any ability that I have. You see, the wise men of Pharaoh, they were astrologers and magicians, and they were trained in all these different incantations to try to bring the future, but they couldn't interpret anything. But Joseph was different. He simply said that God would reveal the meaning of Pharaoh's dream. He listens to Pharaoh, and then he tells him the truth. And then 4 more times in his interpretation, he mentions God. And Pharaoh gets the point. Even though Pharaoh had spent his life believing in multiple gods, he acknowledges that the God of Joseph, the one true God, had told him the truth. In verse 33, Joseph details how he needs to select a wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Now notice, he doesn't ask for the job. He doesn't give a resume. He's not dropping hints. He doesn't even ask to get out of prison. Joseph just shows godly character. He lets the Lord have his way in his life. He knew that in God's time and in God's purposes, God would work out his will in his life. He was humble and he trusted God. And we see in verses 39 through 45 that immediately Pharaoh grabs Joseph and says, "You're that man." And he puts him in charge of the country. He even puts him in charge of his own house. And all the people of Egypt were to follow the commands of Joseph. Only Pharaoh would be higher in Egypt than Joseph. God uses broken things. Only God can bring you through the sufferings in your life. Only God can reward your faithfulness. Only God can open the eyes of the people that believe the slander against you so that they can see the truth. And when it happens, don't be proud. Don't pat yourself on the back. Just be grateful. Be humble. Only God can bring you through the fires. And when you come out of the fire, you will have a character that is pure and stronger and ready for the assignment that God has for you. You know, he promises today that the promises of today are the same as they were in the Old Testament. His grace is still at work and you can trust him. You see, in the Bible, he parted the sea. He brought down city walls. He held the sun in its place. He healed the lepers. He raised Martha's brother. He rolled the stone away. In your life, who can soften a heart of stone? God can. Who can open your eyes to see the truth in Scripture? God can. Who can mold your unforgiving spirit? God can. Who can give you victory over addiction? God can. Who can make you be a blessing to others? God can. Who can give you peace when your health is failing? God can. Who can save your children? God can. Who can save your marriage? God can. Who can answer your prayers? God can. Who can make your faith stronger every day? God can. Joseph trusted God. He knew that God can. Let God do that in your life. Today say, God can, and I believe. We'll see you tomorrow, Willowbrook.